Hello, everybody. Welcome to Brandon's Haunted Library. My name is Brandon, your undead librarian, and I read and talk about fantasy, literary fiction, and of course, horror. Thank you for choosing my video. Hope you stick around because today I'm going to be filling you in on everything I read in February and March. Sorry to anyone that's been patiently waiting on me to upload. I know I haven't been as consistent in 2026 with my videos. Life's been pretty exhausting, but that's okay right now because I'm happy to be here talking with you about books. So, over these past couple months, I've read a total of 8 books. And in terms of genre, I read some horror, of course. 3 of these horror books were actually advanced reader copies, in which 2 were set to publish in April, and the other was pulled from publication over allegations of AI writing. We'll get into it later. I also read a fantasy book in February and a crime thriller and literary fiction. I'll talk about each in order of my favorites from the months, starting with my least favorite and ending with my most favorite. So let's start off with the AI elephant in the room, Shy Girl by Mia Ballard, pulled from publication by Hachette Book Group. Thank you for the advanced reader copy, I guess. I didn't even really want to review this book after all the discourse and drama that developed as I was reading this at the beginning of March. And as the discourse exploded when Hachette pulled the book just a few days after I finished writing my review, I had written a good faith review at the time, offering what I wanted to be helpful criticism to the publisher and author about some of the writing and editing, and give my honest thoughts on the story itself. I tried to share my perspective that the AI allegations were plausible, as various sections of the book were worded strangely in ways that humans don't typically speak. I also wanted to shoot some bail to fellow critics who loved, liked, or didn't pick up on the scent that AI may have been involved in the writing of this book. But myself, I definitely did not like this book, regardless of whether it was AI or just bad writing. I liked the premise, and there was certainly other elements in here that I did like, but it was executed so poorly, in my opinion. The prose was the worst part and took me out of the reading experience, but the story also had bad pacing and character inconsistencies, and an epilogue that made no sense to me at all regarding its relevance. I wanted to review the book on face value as if Ballard is innocent until proven guilty of the AI allegations, but I guess allegedly she has confessed to the possibility that her editor had used AI without her knowing. And apparently lawyers are getting involved, so I'm choosing my words carefully. I don't want to kick the authors back in because there are already so many people on the internet doing that, and that's really not the type of critic that I am. And because of the backlash she's received has gotten so bad, she had to check herself into a mental health facility. And I'm not one to kick someone when they're down. I will say that I think there is not enough criticism being directed towards the publisher and how they handled the entire situation. They are just as responsible for protecting the arts from AI. They are responsible for the content that they publish, and they really dropped the ball with this one. And then releasing the statement that they did, showcasing no accountability and all but confirming the allegations is true and damning Mia Ballard to continue facing the public backlash without any support. I'm honestly getting tired of talking about this book, and I'm not going to give it a star review. This publisher and the publishing industry needs to do better. Readers hate to be tricked. So let's move on. In February, I read The Strength of the Few by James Islington, which is a highly anticipated follow up to his book, The Will of the Many. Going into it, my expectations were pretty high. While I didn't love the first book to the same extent that a lot of other readers did, I still really enjoyed it, especially the world building and the unique magic system. And I was definitely excited to see where the story would go next with how the first book ended. Unfortunately, The Strength of the Few ended up being a bit more of a mixed experience for me. I'd say it was a good book, but not a great one, and ultimately a step down from The Will of the Many in my perspective. It's hard to get into what I didn't like about this without spoiling the book or its predecessor, but I will discuss this spoiler free. One of the biggest strengths of the first book was its immersive Roman inspired setting and the sense of discovery that came with learning how the world and its magic system worked. That element is still present here, but instead of expanding more deeply on what readers loved in the first book, this sequel takes a different approach, introducing new world building in parallel to what the first brought. And this was definitely an ambitious choice, one I can certainly respect Islington for taking, but for me didn't quite land. Another big part of my connection to the first book came from the relationships, particularly the friendships formed at the academy. Even though I wasn't fully sold on Viz as a protagonist, the supporting cast really carried some of the emotional weight, making the story more engaging. But in this sequel, that aspect felt noticeably diminished. Those interpersonal dynamics that once felt central are either weaker or largely absent, and I found myself missing that sense of camaraderie. Structurally, the book follows three separate storylines that rotate every 10 to 30 pages or so. Of the three, there is one that I would consider the main storyline, and that was easily the most compelling for me. And whenever the narrative shifted away from it, I often found myself disengaged and waiting to go back. The other two storylines had their moments, but they felt underdeveloped overall, and I struggled to stay invested in them. By the time I finished the book, it honestly felt like I had read three loosely connected stories, one that I really enjoyed, and the other two that didn't quite come together in a satisfying way. I think this again ties back to the ambition that Islington is trying to do with this series. There's a lot being set up, and while that could pay off in a big way later in the series, in this installment it left parts of the story feeling thin. That said, I know a lot of readers who love the direction this book took, especially the expansion of the world, so it may just come down to a personal preference. I'm definitely still interested in continuing the series, and I'm hopeful that the next book will bring everything together in a more cohesive and impactful way. But compared to how I felt after finishing The Will of the Many, my excitement is definitely more tempered this time around. Overall, I gave The Strength of the Few 3 out of 5 stars. Next, let's talk about Rotten Tommy by David Sodergren. I read two books from David Sodergren in March, both being my introduction to his work. And I gotta say, I enjoy his work and his whimsical approach to horror storytelling that is humorous but still gory and unsettling in a way that just works for me. That said, Rotten Tommy was the weaker of the two books I read from him this month, and I'll get into the other book later in this video. But even then, it was still an experience that I really enjoyed, despite having a few minor issues with it. The story follows our protagonist, Becky, who, during a home renovation, discovers in the walls of her house some mysterious VHS tape and a missing child poster from 40 years ago, with a picture of her. Becky has no memory of ever being kidnapped, but the date on the poster lines up with the same year her mother disappeared. Naturally, this discovery sets her down a path to uncover answers. The VHS tapes themselves contain episodes of a haunting and surreal children's puppet show called Rumplejack, and this is where the book really shines. The footage from the show is deeply unsettling, like a messed up, nightmarish version of something like Sesame Street or The Muppets. As Becky dives deeper into the mysteries, the story becomes increasingly surreal and chaotic in a Alice in Wonderland kind of way. I thought Becky was a really strong main character, and one thing I especially appreciated was how Sodergren handled her autism diagnosis. It felt thoughtful and respectful, and I thought this representation served the story well. The pacing throughout the book is excellent too. It moves quickly and keeps the tension high, but it does go a bit too off the rails for my taste in its climax. For me personally, it pushed just a little too far, but I can absolutely see other readers loving the final act for exactly that reason. Though there is some open endedness and unanswered questions by the end that I know will frustrate some readers, it bothered me a little bit, but not to any serious degree. With a story this batshit and bizarre, I don't really need every detail to be logically wrapped up. The violence and the gore are also worth mentioning. They're insane, but in a very stylized, cartoonish way that perfectly fits the twisted puppet show premise. Sodergren does an impressive job of blending horror and humor, blurring the lines between the two in a way that feels reminiscent of authors like Grady Hendrix or Rachel Harrison, but still very much his own thing. Overall, I had a great time with Rotten Tommy. It didn't quite hit as hard as the other Sodergren book that I read, but it definitely cemented my interest in his work. I can already tell I'll be picking up more of his work this year, with how much I enjoyed his cheesy, yet still creepy approach to horror. I ended up giving Rotten Tommy 3.5 stars out of 5. Next up is another advanced reader copy I was really excited to read. Big thank you to Erewhon Books and Kensington Publishing for giving me a copy of Molka by Monica Kim. This is Monica Kim's second novel, her first being The Eyes Are the Best Part, which was a pretty hyped up book from a couple of years ago that ranked among one of my favorites from that year. So, needless to say, I was really looking forward to this release, and while it doesn't meet the highs of her debut for me, It was still a great book and was deeply unsettling in a very real way that stuck with me. The title Molcha comes from the Korean term for spy cameras, secretly and illegally used to capture voyeuristic images and videos. It is a very real and disturbing issue, and this book confronts this within Korean culture and society at large, not just as an isolated crime, but something rooted in a broader societal and institutional failure. This book follows Dahye, who's been dating and falling head over heels in love for a man named Hyukjun, who is a handsome heir to a high-profile multi-million-dollar fortune. But everything falls apart as they were secretly filmed having sex, and the footage is released online amid Korea's growing Molcha epidemic. Dahye is abandoned as Hyukjun flees the country, leaving her to face the fallout on her own. All the while, Dahye has a creepy coworker named Junyoung, who is secretly spies on his coworkers with his own hidden camera in the women's restroom stall, and he develops an increasing obsession over Dahye. This is very much a slow burn descent into female rage. The story doesn't rush to revenge, but instead Kim spends much of the novel with the protagonist in a vulnerable and helpless headspace as the story ramps up on the depravity and violence committed by the men all around her. Whether they be active participants in capturing the voyeuristic media, perverted viewers, or indifferent men of authority that blame women for their victimization and forgive men for their depravity. One of Kim's greatest strengths, which carries from her debut, is her ability to write absolutely despicable male characters. Junyoung, the perverted coworker, in particular, is deeply unsettling, and the chapters told from his perspective are some of the most disturbing in the book. Being placed inside his mind is uncomfortable in the best and worst way possible, and it really reinforced the horror of the situation. I also appreciated how the book avoids simplifying the issue. It doesn't frame these crimes as actions of a few bad apples, but rather symptoms of a larger systemic problem: patriarchy, institutional indifference, and the normalization of exploitation. Even though the book doesn't explicitly dive into modern technology like AI generated deepfakes, it's hard not to draw parallels to how easily images can be manipulated and weaponized today. Nowadays, such disgusting media can be produced from innocent images that are consensually shared through social media and non consensually used to sexualize and humiliate women. It's an infuriating issue, and this book elicits those feelings of fury so well. If I had one main critique, it's that this novel takes a bit too long to reach its emotional payoff. When the catharsis does come, it is impactful and the rage is resonant, but I found myself wanting just a little bit more, either by pushing the climax further or giving that final act a higher page count and more room to breathe. The best part was such a visceral experience for me, and I guess I just wished Molka came closer to those levels. There are also some supernatural elements in the story that, for me, slightly detracted from the otherwise gritty and realistic tone that the story delivered. Overall, Molka is a gripping, unsettling, and socially relevant horror novel that delivers a powerful emotional punch, even if it doesn't quite match the intensity of Kim's debut. I ended up giving Molka 3.5 stars. Next up, I read Penance by Eliza Clark. This is a fictionalized true crime novel centered around the gruesome murder of a high school girl committed by three of her friends in a coastal town in the north of England. But what sets this book apart isn't just the crimes itself, it's how the story is told. The story is presented as the definitive account of the case, written by a disgraced journalist who compiles interviews, witness statements, court transcripts, podcast excerpts, and even pieces of online investigative journalism. But from page one, we know that this narrator cannot be trusted. The book opens with a note from the fictional publisher explaining that his work was pulled from shelves after it was revealed that many of his interviews were illegally obtained, and large portions of the stories were fabricated and false. And then, almost immediately, the journalist discloses that he wrote the book in part to capitalize on the true crime market and to profit off the audience obsessed with stories like this. That framing alone made Penance a fascinating read for me. It's not really telling a story about crime, but instead it's critiquing the true crime industry and the culture surrounding it. The fictional journalist does a lot throughout the course of the story to criticize the true crime community, all while participating in the same machine to sensationalize the story of this gruesome murder. If you enjoy unreliable narrators like I do, this book really delivers. The journalist is so hypocritical in ways that feel very intentional and maybe satirical. There are moments where he looks down on online groups that write crime fan fiction, all while he is essentially doing the same thing, whether knowingly or unknowingly. The narrator is insufferable, to put it bluntly. He has a very clear lack of understanding and empathy for the teenage girls at the center of the story, and that perspective can make parts of the book frustrating to read. His writing style is also deliberately overwritten, which adds to that sense of irritation. The book spends a lot of time also diving into side characters and tangents that feel unrelated to the central crime, making it longer and more tedious than it probably needs to be. But I think to a degree that's the point, as it is a piece of art interested in confronting its reader. It forces one to reflect on our own relationship with true crime, what parts of the story you're drawn to, what you find boring, when you feel tempted to skim ahead, and why. It holds a mirror up to the audience and asks some uncomfortable questions about consumption, curiosity, and exploitation. For me, that for me that made it a pretty compelling experience, even when it was frustrating. It's also the kind of book that I think would reward a reread because so much of the earlier material can be recontextualized once you reach the end, in an endless, impossible pursuit for the truth. Overall, Penance is a sharp, confronting, and cleverly constructed critique of true crime and its supposed objectivity. I ended up giving it 4 stars. Next up is the other book by David Sodergren I read, the book called The Horror. A book I definitely enjoyed more than Rotten Tommy, but both have a campy horror appeal that I really appreciated. The book follows an elderly widow named Marielle who has lived in a small coastal Scottish town for her whole life. Her quiet existence is threatened when an American property developer starts buying up land to build a golf course and is looking for a way to evict Marielle, who refuses to leave her home. From there, the story sets up a clear conflict between Marielle and these almost cartoonishly evil representatives of corporate greed. Marielle is an incredible protagonist to follow and is so easy to root for her, especially given the position she's in. The story explores themes of loneliness and grief, particularly as she processes the loss of her husband, and there are moments in here that are genuinely heartbreaking, but at the same time, she's resilient, strong willed, and refuses to be pushed aside. Where the horror comes in is through the horror itself, the dense Scottish fog, which brings with it a shape shifting sea creature that Muriel unexpectedly befriends. It's a bizarre premise that works incredibly well. In fact, this ends up being one of the more surprisingly heartwarming horror stories I've read in a while. There's even a bit of romance in here too, which adds another element to Muriel's emotional arc as she navigates her grief. It's not something you see often in a story this violent and gory, but Sodergren manages to balance those extremes really well. And yes, the gore is absolutely here. It's graphic, over the top, and when directed at the story's greedy antagonists, it feels both brutal and darkly satisfying. But what impressed me most is that the book never loses sight of its emotional core. The setting also deserves a mention, as the small coastal town is so vividly described that you can practically feel the cold, salty air in the fog rolling in. It adds a strong folk horror atmosphere that really enhances the story. This is a short, intense read that I flew through over a weekend, and it's one I'd easily recommend to a wide range of readers. Whether you're here for the gore, the emotional storytelling, or the anti corporate themes, there's something here for everyone. I thought that this was great overall, and I gave The Horror 4 stars. Next up is the final advanced reader copy I read. Japanese Gothic by Kylie Lee Baker was a beautiful and surreal Gothic nightmare set in Japan. Thank you to Harlequin Trade Publishing and Hanover Square Press for giving me a copy to review. This was one of my most anticipated reads, and I'm very happy to say it delivered for me. Without revealing too much, this story follows 2 main characters across 2 separate timelines, with their storylines gradually revealing how they're connected. In the present day, there is Lee Turner, a student at NYU who believes he has murdered his roommate, but has no recollection as to why and where he put the body. He travels to Japan to visit his father, who lives in a remote home that Lee senses something terribly wrong with. This house, we find out, is a samurai house, as our other timeline unravels in 1877 with Sen, the daughter of a samurai living in the same home, hidden behind the sword ferns. Her story focuses on her upbringing and her father's relentless efforts to train her into an emotionless samurai warrior. as their class fights for their survival in a rapidly changing Japan. Both of our main characters were really well developed, making both of their stories enjoyable to follow. Sen's story in particular really stood out to me. I love seeing her determination to earn honor and identity within a rigid and often brutal system, and the historical backdrop of the samurai era in decline was great to read about and added tension to her story. It was also fascinating to follow Lee as we experience his disjointed and unreliable perception of reality while we unravel more and more about the murder and Lee's diminishing mental state. Kylie Lee Baker has proven herself skilled at crafting contemporary horror stories, with her impressive horror debut Bat Eater set in the early 2020s, and Japanese Gothic continues to show this mastery, but she also shows her skills at writing historical horror here as well, all while weaving in Japanese folklore in a way I absolutely adored by the end of the book. This book is a bit of a fever dream. It's weird, atmospheric, and surreal, which is something I personally love in horror. The atmosphere that the author creates was strong in both timelines, really creating a sense of gothic dread in the right moments. I would have loved for the prose to lean even further into the gothic, something a bit more poetic and indulgent, but that's purely a personal preference, and I think the writing as it stands is still beautiful and effective. Pushing it further might not work for every reader. The violence and gore are also handled extremely well. The 1877 timeline, in particular, does not shy away from the brutality of samurai life, and those scenes are vivid and impactful. And while the modern timeline is more cerebral in its horror, when it does turn visceral, it absolutely lands. I'm very curious to see what more people think about this because I imagine the ending will be divisive and unsatisfying for some. It leans heavily into the book's dreamlike and ambiguous qualities, which I personally loved, but I can see it not working for some. Overall, I really admired this book. While her previous Bat Eaters and Other Names for Corazang was among one of my favorite books from last year, I love Japanese Gothic even more. It's emotionally resonant, thematically rich, and suspenseful and scary when it needs to be. While it didn't quite reach a full 5 stars for me, it came very close, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if my rating increases the more I sit with it. I ended up giving Japanese Gothic 4.5 stars. And finally, my favorite book of the past 2 months, I Am Not Sidney Poitier by Percival Everett. Percival Everett is perhaps most known for his two most recent books, The Trees and James, the latter of the two earning the coveted Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And James was a book I also read and did really enjoy, though perhaps not as much as I would have hoped for going in. But this earlier work, originally published in 2009, completely won me over. I Am Not Sidney Poitier is one that I absolutely loved. The book is described as an irreverent take on race, class, and identity in America, and I found it to be compulsively readable and oftentimes laugh out loud funny. The story follows a young black man who is quite absurdly named Not Sidney Poitier, and Everett takes that premise and runs with it in ways that are both hilarious and deeply insightful. To make matters even more absurd, Not Sidney actually resembles a young Sidney Poitier, which only amplifies the strange and often uncomfortable situations he finds himself as he grows from adolescence into young adulthood. It is a story interested in identity and how people are perceived by others by the color of their skin, the class they come from, the way they look, or the name that they carry. And while the book is comedic in tone, the events he experiences are deeply sad and reflective of common experience for many black men. He is sexually assaulted by a white teacher, wrongfully arrested for being black, hazed by black fraternity brothers for not being black enough, and looked down upon by black conservatives for his dark complexion. These moments should be uncomfortable and they reflect very real societal issues, but Everett somehow manages to present them through a lens that is both satirical and darkly humorous. It really makes me wonder how Everett manages to pull off the humor of this novel with material that can be so heavy. That balance is what impressed me most. He has the ability to execute comedic callbacks that cross taboo lines but crosses them twice so that they become absurd rather than insensitive. And that absurdity in itself is revealing. There's a character in the book that teaches a course on nonsense at the HBCU that Not Sidney attends, pondering mundane and circular questions as unanswerable and viewed as brilliant and profound by his class. It is a funny and self-aware jab at pretentiousness in academia, self-aware as the professor's name is Percival Everett. Structurally, this novel feels very stream of consciousness, a kind of make it up as we go along type attitude, but it is in fact carefully constructed. The pacing, the callbacks, the escalation of absurdity, all carefully constructed. It is a playful quality that actually reminded me a lot of one of my favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut, in that way. Both Vonnegut and Everett make their narrator's voice as the guiding force of their chaotic and unconventional storytelling, but that voice is still carefully constructed, and their stories are deliberately paced to guide the reader to specific conclusions or punchlines. But it is in no way derivative of Vonnegut or any other writers for that matter. Everett has his own voice and identity, which is so original, and I've fallen in love with his writing with this book. It's rare to find something this funny that also has this much to say, and say it so effectively. I gave I Am Not Sidney Poitier 4.5 stars, and it is my favorite read of the year so far. And that's all the books I read in February and March. Thank you so much for hanging out and watching my video. If you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss my next one. But until next time, feel free to drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on any of these books or whatever books you've been loving lately. As always, happy reading everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.